Hello, Scouts. It's Mr. Kugler, and we're going to have some fun today making what I call a sweet biscuit. And this recipe actually has some great ties to the scouting movement and the scouting program. And it dates back to the 1972 printing, copyright 1965, of the Scouting Fieldbook. And this has a great recipe in here, which is basically a basic baking type mix or biscuit mix. What I've done is I've adapted it a little bit by adding a little sugar, some chocolate chips to make it more of like a scone, what I call a sweet biscuit. So the recipe calls for 4 cups of flour. And what I've done, because I don't need that much of the baking mix today, so what I've done is I've cut it in half and I have a mix that uses 2 cups of flour and all the other ingredients are proportional. It includes some salt, some powdered milk. And what I like about this powdered milk that we purchased is it came in a box with a number of pouches in it. And this helps so that I don't have to open up a big box and have it go stale. I can use a smaller pouch. I have a greater chance of using it before it goes bad. And I have other pouches for down the road when I do other dishes. It includes some baking powder. That's our leavening agent. It includes margarine, which will act as our fat. So what I've done is, to make it sweet, I've added some sugar to the mix. And to make it a little extra special, I put some mini chocolate chips in our mix. And I used about 2 tablespoons of the mini chocolate chips. Now, certainly I could have brought all these ingredients and the salt and the margarine and the flour, but what was easier to do was to take, and in a quart bag, I was able to combine all the ingredients. I cut up the margarine into smaller little pea-sized chunks of the margarine, and I mixed it in with my dry ingredients so that it's all ready to go. In a moment, we're actually going to mix the ingredients right in this container. Now, the last ingredient that I didn't mention is water. And we're going to need 6 ounces of water. So I took a 8-ounce container. I measured out my water, so I don't need to worry about it. But certainly, you could do this in the field with a measuring cup and measure out your water. It's 3/4 of a cup is what that amounts to. The recipe calls for the water to be cold. So that is an important thing to consider. And then certainly bring some nonstick spray so that you can coat the inside of your Dutch oven so that your biscuits don't stick. Before I get going mixing our ingredients, I've got some charcoal going in the back in my chimney, and it's time to get our 10-inch regular depth Dutch oven preheating. I'm going to be using the ring method of coals, and I'm going to do 1 ring on the bottom, 1 ring on the top. That should bring us about 325 degrees. So let me start off with the ring on the bottom, which should be about 8 coals. Got my gloves on so I don't hurt myself. Just going to take my tongs and spread out my coals into that circle. Take my Dutch oven, set it right there, and now I will do a ring of coals on the outside edge, which should be around 12 coals, maybe a little bit more. So with my heat on, preheating my Dutch oven, I'll add a couple extra briquettes of charcoal in our chimney, so if we need more as the baking process goes on, we have a ready supply. So one good idea to use when you're pre-mixing your ingredients in Ziploc bags for a camping trip is obviously to label what's in there so that you don't get it mixed up with something else. Perhaps you have a similar type mix that you're going to be making, but maybe it's a mix of regular biscuits that don't contain the chocolate chips, and it may get confusing. So make sure you label it. It's also important to write on the outside of the packet what is left to be added to this mix. Because I use the powdered milk, I'm just able to add water, and I don't need to worry about bringing milk. So I've written on the outside of the package the directions to add 6 ounces of water, cold water, to the mix. So we'll do that now. One of the things that I found interesting about the article in the Fieldbook where they talked about this is they talked about making a really big batch, and they were actually mixing it in a flour sack where they poured it in, and once the water combined, they knew they had the right consistency. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to mix in our plastic bag. I'm going to only add about 3/4 of my water at first because I could always add more, but I don't want to get it too soupy or too wet. Certainly I've got some extra flour here to be able to add if I needed to get the right consistency, but you may not have that always available to you when you're doing this. So let's get started adding our water. I'm going to take and make a little bit of a well or a dimple in my mix here. I've got my gloves on so I could touch it safely. And now I have a spoon. This actually dates back to my late grandmother's farm back in the early 1900s. This was gifted to me. It's special, and I'm going to use this to stir up our batter. What I like about it, it doesn't have any sharp edges, so it's not going to break that bag. It's got a nice little paddle. It looks like I can add the rest of my water. And the great thing about using the Ziploc bag is I could seal up, remove the air, and I can also mix it even without the spoon, just mixing it together in the bag. I want this to come together so I can get a nice clump. The gloves are great because I'm going to be taking and working this with my hand, and I can see that there's still a little bit of powder at the bottom here. Dump this out onto my cutting board. You certainly could do this in a mixing bowl. What I'm trying to do here is to utilize the same container that I brought it in as my mixing container. Now I'll just take and combine the rest of it. Really starting to come together nicely. So what I've done is I've made a 3/4 inch thickness patty. I don't want it to be too thick because I want it to be able to bake evenly. So I have 3/4 of an inch thick. You could start to see those chocolate chips showing up. And we'll go check on our Dutch oven and see how it's doing with the preheating. Add a little of the nonstick spray on the bottom. I'm going to take and I'm going to cut this into pieces. Now, I suppose I could do this in the Dutch oven, but my concern is that the Dutch oven is preheated. Take. Lay these out in my Dutch oven. I'll give a little bit of space between them if I'm able, just so they have a little room to grow. So one of the things that I want to do is I want to add a little extra sugar on the very top of our biscuits. I'll sprinkle that right out of the bag. Now you certainly could have prepackaged a little bit of this sugar in a Ziploc bag so that you didn't have to bring the bag of sugar with you. Now we'll put our Dutch oven lid on, give it a slight turn there, make sure it's seated well, and we'll let these bake. So periodically during the baking process, I'm going to come over to my Dutch oven, take my lid, I'm going to spin it about a third of a turn one direction. I'm going to come over, I'm going to grab the bail, lift it slightly, and give it a third of a turn the other direction. So this will help ensure that my sweet biscuits bake evenly. I'll also come in and check the heat, bringing my hand in slowly to get a feel for the amount of heat there to see if I need to replenish the heat at all. It's also important to consider maybe adding heat to your top and maybe backing off a little bit on the bottom heat towards the end of the baking process, in that our biscuits are in direct contact with the cast iron on the bottom, but there's that air gap or air space on the top. So Scouts, we're about a half an hour in, 30 minutes in. Quite honestly, I lost track of the time, and the time really isn't as important to the cooking, except for obviously meal planning, making sure everything's done when you need it. What truly is important is when the dinner is done or the dish is done, that you recognize when it's done. Took a little peek in here a couple minutes ago. They're looking great. What I did do was I backed off of the bottom heat. I pulled what was left of the coals out a little bit. I had added about 10 minutes in, because doing the filming, it's difficult to keep fresh coals going all the time leading up to adding them. So they were a little bit past prime when I added them. The other thing I did is I added coals probably about 3 times, just adding not a ton, like 4 or 5 at a time, and I would nest them. I think the first time I probably did about 6 or 8 in between. And then I added a little bit in the middle. I checked the bottoms, and the bottom of the biscuits were looking great. So that's why I backed off the heat and just tried to add some top heat. So we'll go in, we'll have a little look. We'll take and poke it with the knife and see if they're cooked all the way through. Oh, those are looking good. So we'll take a knife and we'll just poke inside here and look down into one of these. Oh, they are looking great. Take a spatula and let's get one of these out. Bottom looks awesome. So let's take and break one open. And I'll look at how fluffy that looks. So delicious. I could taste the chocolate chips. I could taste that sugar on the top. They're perfectly cooked right through. Simple to make. Hopefully you'll consider this recipe of sweet biscuits on your next camping trip. We prepared the ingredients ahead of time. We had powdered milk in the ingredients, so all we had to do was add cold water. We were able to mix it for the most part in the bag. We could have done it in a bowl. Able to put it in our 10-inch regular Dutch oven. In about 30-35 minutes, we had these great sweet biscuits ready to satisfy any camper on a nice camp morning. So get out there with your patrol and troop. Try different cooking methods, try different recipes, but most of all, get outside in the great outdoors and enjoy yourself.